When I told my family I was getting married, that my fiancé's family was covering every expense, even a fully furnished lakeside villa, the room reacted the way it always had when I hoped for anything, with indifference and a small, sharp joke. "Oh, really, my father, George Clark," snorted without looking up from the Tribune. "And who's the lucky man?" My mother, Mary Ann, barely glanced from her phone. "Yes, when do we get to meet him?" she asked with a politeness that lived on autopilot. Ethan, my brother, was leaning back at the end of the table, thumbs moving across his screen. He offered a grin that was more practiced than genuine. "Yeah, when do we meet Prince Charming?" he drawled, and it wasn't the teasing you can tolerate from family, it had a barbed edge I'd learned to expect. I lifted my left hand anyway and let the sapphire, set within old minted gold, catch the light. For 2 hours my stomach was full of butterflies and my voice was steady. Lucas had proposed the previous weekend at Lake Geneva. The ring was his grandmother's. Lucas had told me about how she'd always kept the stone in a velvet box in a cedar chest. He'd been nervous, hands shaking, and when he'd asked me to marry him it felt like my whole life had finally been recognized. "It's beautiful," my mother said without looking up. My father grunted something that could have been congratulations, or just the sound a man makes when forced to add words. Ethan's eyes flicked to the stone, a quick, sharp emotion crossed his face, not envy exactly, but something like calculation. I didn't know how to interpret it. "We're getting married September 20th, I told them. Lucas's family is covering the venue, the food, the flowers. He's even told me they've purchased a villa by the lake as a wedding gift." "Oh, great," my father said, the sarcasm as comfortable as a chair. "Who's the lucky guy?" "You'll meet him tomorrow night," I said. "I want you to meet him." "Sure, whatever," my mother said, already distracted, the words like a window closed mid-sentence. "Ethan, can you pick up the dry cleaning on your way?" It was not the reaction I'd hoped for, and for a second that giddy bubble of excitement popped in my chest. An old, familiar ache crawled back in. I left their house with the kind of determination that comes from someone who needs to prove wrongness with living a life anyway. The next evening, when I introduced Lucas, he carried a bottle of wine and flowers. He looked like someone who belonged in a different kind of life than the one I'd grown up in, calm, confident in that quiet way someone who's been loved correctly becomes. He smiled at my mother, chatted with my father about some civil engineering joke I didn't understand, and was polite and warm to Ethan. He wanted to make a good impression, I could see it. But I didn't expect the way my family's faces changed the minute they heard his last name. "Davenport," my father pivoted like a windmill. "Davenport Foundation?" "Yes, sir," Lucas said, smiling and offering his hand. My mother was suddenly all warmth. Ethan's smirk turned into a polished grin, the kind he reserved for the room where people mattered. They peppered him with questions about the foundation, about the villa, about the wedding plans. I sat beside him and watched them orbit him like planets, invisible to his gravity until they learned its mass. After dinner I went to the powder room. From behind the door I heard Ethan's voice. "Lucas, can I have a word?" He asked what, I didn't know. The hallway was narrow, the light a shallow wash. My heart, which had been light with hope, turned strangely heavy. He pulled Lucas aside and spoke so low I couldn't make out a word. Lucas's face went still. I left the bathroom early, tried to sound casual on the walk home. "What did he say?" I asked later that night. "Just small talk," Lucas replied, but his voice had a distance I didn't like. It was a detail I left in the margin of my mind, something that looked like a smudge and might be nothing, or might be the first indication of ink running. Lucas and I dated 8 months and then he proposed. The engagement felt like a small revolution in my life. Patricia and James Davenport, his parents, were astonishingly kind. Lucas' father loved books and humbly bragged about how the foundation's grant supported the city library's renovation. Patricia took me out for tea and smiled like I had always been the daughter she'd wanted. They insisted on taking care of all wedding expenses out of a desire to make our day special. They were generous in a way that made me dizzy. I told myself, foolishly and with hope, that perhaps their openness and acceptance might finally be reflected in my childhood home's eyes. Maybe if they met Lucas, if he stood with me shoulder to shoulder, my parents would see me as someone worthy of attention. I wanted it like you want someone to come to your funeral and say your name correctly. That is probably a poor image, but it's accurate. The months that followed were a whirl, dress fittings with Patricia, who insisted the dress be everything I wanted, tastings of food I'd never thought to eat in my life, the Drake Hotel secured for the reception, and a guest list that seemed to expand with each handed-off name. I worked with planners and photographers. I collected ribbons and notes and linen swatches that looked like falls of muted color. Lucas's family's help never felt patronizing, only warm, and it made me grateful every time they told me to choose what felt right. But something else was gathering friction, a small tension like the hum before a switch is flipped. Ethan began dropping by the apartment more, unannounced. At first, the visit seemed casual, he'd say he was, in the neighborhood, or, just grabbing a coffee. Then more often it was, dropping off things for Marianne, or, bringing you something from Mom. The visits only added to my unease. Lucas waved them off. He's family, he said once. He's probably nervous too. I wanted to believe him because denying it required stepping into an uncomfortable territory where I might see things I couldn't unsee. On the morning of the wedding, the suite at the Drake felt like a shimmering, fragile world. My dress hung like a promise on the closet door, a cloud of couture lace that had cost more than the first car I ever owned. My hair and makeup were done by 11. Martha, the makeup artist, fluffed my cheeks with a brush and said, "You look like you could float away." For the first time in my life I felt seen in a way that wasn't just casual, I felt beautiful. But my mother began to stall in small ways. She needed lipstick, and then the other lipstick, and a phone call to check the seating chart, and then, suddenly, a last-minute adjustment to her hair. Each delay looked small until the photographer's text started piling up on my phone. At 12:45, with the ceremony scheduled for 2, I heard the soft beep of the hallway's automatic lock. My mother stepped into the corridor, closed the door behind her, and I heard the click of the hotel's locking mechanism. She had always liked a measure of theater, a way to locate the spotlight on herself. But the sound that followed changed the tone. "Tell security she's unstable," my mother said into her phone. "Tell them she's having a breakdown. A psychiatrist is on the way." I didn't know what to say. The words were absurd enough I almost laughed. "I'm not unstable," I shouted at the door. "Open this. You can't do this." A guard said, softly and without understanding the word's weight at all, "Ma'am, we've been informed there's a psychiatric situation. For your safety, please remain in the room. A doctor will be coming." They had lied. They had called the hotel and spun it into a drama that would lock me inside until the ceremony, until my wedding day, was over. The suite blurred into a haze. I pounded on the door. "You can't do this," I pleaded. "You're going to ruin everything. This is unlawful." My mother's voice drifted through, sweet and predatory. "Don't worry. The real bride is already there. Your brother." I froze, and then the truth fell like a stone into a shallow pond. Ethan emerged from the bathroom in a tuxedo. He wasn't wearing a groomsman's suit. He was wearing the clothes of the man who belonged at the front of the church. "Lucas and I have been in love for months," Ethan said, his voice even and rehearsed. "Since the night you brought him home." The story unspooled faster than the room could absorb. He'd spoken to Lucas in the hallway earlier that night, again and again. He'd been waiting for an opening. He'd spun a web. There was a carefully cultivated narrative I had never seen, with emails and messages and precise manipulations. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. "No," I said. "You are lying. He loves me." My mother laughed, low and satisfied. "Technically, someone is getting married today," she said. "Your brother, not you." She had that small, boiling glee of someone certain the world would now be ordered into the place she believed it should be. "You were always good at being in the background." I could not move. The room, the world where I had prepared, where my dress waited, where my life with someone I loved had been planned, constricted into a small, bright internment. I grabbed my laptop because it was the only tool I had immediate access to. Years earlier, when we shared a family computer, Ethan had been careless with passwords. He'd assumed his sister wouldn't pry. I had cracked them once out of petty curiosity and had never bothered to close the gap. That night I felt grateful for foolish, quiet knowledge I'd kept to myself. His email was a time capsule of everything I feared. Threads went back months. I read them like a forensic specialist reading bones. At first it was subtle, a flirtatious message that read like an experiment, a compliment in the wrong tone. Then it became an orchestrated campaign, photographs that had been doctored, messages implying an affair, fake receipts, fabricated hotel bookings that tied together false timelines. There were messages from burner numbers. There were glowing claims that everyone would believe if told in a very particular way. At the bottom of the thread was a reply from Lucas, a short message time-stamped the night before. He wrote, in a line that felt like a lifeline, "I'll play along until I can figure something out. Give me until after the ceremony. I won't betray you." He was protecting me. He had been trying to give me a path out of the trap without having to subject me to publicity and ruin. I remember feeling a gratitude so sharp it was almost painful, and then a new, furious clarity. The people who'd plotted this thought they could silence me in the name of decorum. I took screen after screen of evidence, text messages, photos, schedules, the emails to the hotel instructing them to claim a psychiatric emergency. There were messages from my mother to Ethan, "Make sure she stays inside. We can't have her making a scene." There was an email thread where Marianne carefully researched the legality. I sat there, fingers shaking, while the lock beeped and the sound of footsteps receded into the corridor. In the silence my world seemed tiny and brittle. Then I did the thing I should have done the moment I knew they were plotting. I sent an email. Not to family, but to the guest list and vendors. I attached screenshots of the malicious messages, the fabricated receipts, the email instructing the hotel to hold me because I was unstable. I wrote the truth in a calm voice: my sister and my mother were attempting to steal my wedding and my life. I sent it to everyone, to the Drake Hotel event manager, to the florist, the photographer, to Lucas's parents, and to every single person invited to the ceremony. The subject line read, "Why today's wedding has been cancelled, the truth about Ethan Clark." I also posted everything publicly, on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and tagged as many people as I could. Then I called the police and filed a report. People started responding almost immediately. I heard the shuffle of shoes moments later as police arrived. Patricia Davenport, Lucas's mother, was already on the phone, tears in her voice. She'd read my email while walking to the elevator, she'd called James, and he'd come immediately. The two of them arrived with a presence and a righteous, solid disbelief that somehow steadied me. The officers asked my mother for proof of the psychiatrist. There was none. The security guard who'd followed Marianne's instructions had been complicit, but when the officers asked him if a psychiatrist had been called he stammered. When he admitted no doctor was coming, the police said the only logical response: they would open the door. I walked out of the suite still in my robe, escorted by an officer, and took the elevator to the ballroom. The doors opened and a hush fell over 200 people. My sister stood at the altar in a white gown that was too small for the occasion and too large for the decency of what she tried to do. Ethan looked hollow behind his own facade. Lucas stood next to him, eyes haunted. The minister's voice died in his throat when I walked in. "Sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice louder than I felt. The room watched me like a stage player in someone's cruel play. "I am Isabella Clark. This is my wedding." People reached for their phones to check the email. Faces shifted from confusion to understanding to dismay. Lucas walked toward me and took my hands. "I'm so sorry," he said, and his eyes were full of apology. "I didn't tell you because I thought I could fix this quietly. She threatened my family. She threatened to ruin everything. I was trying to figure out proof. I never intended this." I held up my phone. "I have the proof," I said. "Emails, photos, receipts, texts. They planned to have me locked in a room while my sister walked down the aisle." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Somebody shouted, "Call the police." Ethan attempted to run. James Davenport, a large, solid man who'd spent his life in board meetings and philanthropy, blocked him. "You tried to destroy my son and humiliate his bride," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to just run." They arrested my parents and Ethan that afternoon on charges of conspiracy, attempted fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The hotel turned over security footage showing Marianne on the phone and the guard locking the door, the footage that made their case airtight. But that was only the start. I didn't want just arrests. I wanted to make sure that the damage they had attempted to inflict did not simply evaporate into private shame and family whispers. They'd tried to construct a life for themselves on a lie. I intended to dismantle it precisely and publicly. I built a website over the following week with each piece of evidence laid out plainly, email headers, screenshots, times, and a timeline. The tone was clear, clinical. There were no embellishments, no dramatic flourishes, just the facts. I gave it a simple title, The Truth About Ethan Clark. Patricia and James Davenport hired an attorney I'd later be grateful to call an ally, Carlin Gwynn, a litigation specialist who'd cut her teeth on high-stakes civil suits and who loved clear evidence the way some people loved symphonies. With Carla's help, we filed civil suits not just for the unlawful imprisonment but for attempted identity theft and fraud. The criminal charges, meanwhile, moved forward. The DA saw the advantage of the case, a high-profile scheme, reams of written evidence, and a sympathetic victim. It had the kind of factual clarity they loved. In the weeks that followed, the full ripple of consequences poured outward like oil on water. My father, George, who'd worked as a mortgage broker for 20 years, saw his license come under scrutiny. I filed a complaint with the state regulatory board containing the emails and notes that tied his actions to the creation of credible fake documents for Ethan to use. Under the microscope, auditors found other irregularities, little bad practices that had been tolerated for years, fudging valuation dates, ambiguous disclosures, things that, under casual circumstances, might have been swept aside. But now, with his name in headlines and with the state watching, it became a liability. His firm let him go. My mother had been a pillar in the local charity circuit, co-chairing events, organizing galas, cultivating donors. She'd built her life on those relationships. I called every charity board she was associated with and forwarded a careful dossier with the evidence. I didn't shame them. I simply presented the material and let them decide what to do. They decided quickly. Major donors, some of whom had been invited to the wedding, pulled funding. Boards acted quickly when money is at stake, the optics turned into financial risk. Within a month, my mother was asked to resign from every position she held. Ethan's social life evaporated. The gym where he'd watched Lucas named him on a banned list and informed other locations. His social media presence contracted until there were only deserted accounts. The website I'd created was optimized, anyone searching his name found it within seconds. Ethan, faced criminal charges that had teeth. The DA announced an intention to pursue stalking, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted identity theft, and criminal harassment. The evidence, screenshots of messages in his own words, hotel footage, witnesses, made a compelling case. His defense tried to claim a mental health crisis, a claim that, after reading emails showing careful planning and logistical coordination that mapped across months, looked weak. In court the threads I'd read in the hotel suite were read aloud. The digital forensics expert testified about Photoshop artifacts in the doctored images Ethan had sent Lucas and about how the fake receipts had been traced to a template site he'd accessed through his browser. The forensics firm traced the burner numbers to a web of prepaid phones and a pattern of repeated harassment. All of it was damning. I gave testimony. I sat in a courtroom and listened to the words I'd collected be read in front of people I didn't know, people who would later say in interviews they'd never seen anything like it. I did not cry on the stand. I avoided dramatic gestures because drama had been the weapon they'd wielded against me, manufactured scenes, half-truths, and theatrics. I kept to the facts, dates, times, messages. But legality was never the whole plan. I had to make sure the consequences became structural. I wanted their reputations, the currency of their social world, to fracture. I didn't want to ruin anyone's life for sport. I wanted a proportional response to what they had attempted. They'd planned to publicly humiliate me on my wedding day. They had attempted to steal my future. I wanted their world to know, to face the truth, so they could not easily go back to the comfortable circles they'd once occupied. We reached out quietly and carefully to people who'd been invited to the wedding, to neighbors, to the bridge club, to the houses of worship where my mother had once been a pillar. I didn't ask them to ostracize my family. I just provided evidence and answered questions. People decided. Donors withdrew. Boards issued statements. Women who had lunch with my mother for years called me privately to say they were appalled and had chosen to distance themselves. Some apologized for not noticing, others said they had but had chosen not to interfere. The wrenching thing is that you can have influential friends who are comfortable with your charming veneer until the press uncovers the harm. Then who you are matters more than you thought. So, slowly, the scaffolding that had supported my parents cracked. My father lost his job. My mother lost her positions and obligations. The charity boards felt pressured by donors who pulled funding. The social network that had insulated them receded. They found themselves in small apartments rather than the house where I had grown up. Money and social capital are not the same things, but often the loss of one precipitates the loss of the other. Ethan suffered the worst fall. His conviction, because he was convicted, meant a mark he could not scrub clean for years. The DA pushed hard. The judge, faced with a mountain of evidence and testimony from multiple professional witnesses, handed down a sentence that reflected the public nature of the offense and the planned cruelty. He was sentenced to time that meant significant recalibration of his life. I did not, even then, feel pure joy. Retribution is complicated. Watching someone spend years in the small, constrained world of a prison cell is not the same as feeling healed. What I did feel, steadfastly, was peace. In the months that followed the trial, Lucas and I rebuilt our life in a quieter, meaningful way. We postponed the grand wedding. A small ceremony at his parents' estate in Connecticut, surrounded by true friends and family who had not been manipulated into doing damage, felt more honest than any masquerade. We took the house by the lake and filled it not with ostentation but with things that mattered: books on shelves, the scent of Patricia's baked bread on Sunday mornings, the sound of children's laughter later on, footfall across hardwood in the evening. Before the wedding, though, there were practicalities to handle. I worked with Carla to pursue civil suits again, this time seeking damages for reputational loss and for the emotional and professional harm done. Lawyers on our side worked efficiently and carefully. Eventually we settled with the hotel for their complicity. The security guard who'd taken a bribe was fired and later pled guilty to one count. The hotel issued a statement of regret. Those are the kinds of statements corporations make when the PR calculus is clear. It helped less than it read in print. Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who had watched from the sidelines her whole life, reached out. She had been present at the wedding fiasco, but her reach had been limited by the apparatus my mother had erected. When I published the website, Linda called and said, simply, "I am sorry. I wish I had seen it sooner." Then she told stories of things the two of us had experienced as children that contextualized the pattern: how Marianne had structured family photographs to always include Ethan in the foreground, how small victories of mine had been subtly erased with a shrug and a handshake. She apologized for being silent. Her apology held weight because it came with detail and acknowledgement that neither tried to excuse itself with vagueness. Time cleansed details but not the memory. It offered a new world, though. Lucas and I married in an intimate ceremony 2 months later. No drama. We read our own vows, a quiet exchange of promises to be there when the world was not. Patricia and James wept as they always had, not from the weary performative sorrow of the wealthy, but from the rawness of parents who had watched their son fight to protect what he loved. We filled the lake house with small, daily consistencies that are often undervalued: Lucy's habit of making tea for me in the afternoons, mundane errands turned into a rhythm, and then, later, the chaos of children's toys and voices. Our first child was a daughter, whom we named Margaret after Lucas's mother. She had the calm, inquisitive eyes that make you feel like the world might be more solvable than you thought. 2 years later we had a son. Their laughter and mischief heated the rooms of the house. Their presence was a kind of therapy, a thing that scrambled grief into something human. 5 years after the day that had been stolen from me, which now read like a pivot in the story of my life, a point where things either collapsed or made new sense, I received a letter from Ethan. He'd served time, and now on parole he wanted to speak. The letter was short, formal, the kind of letter written on stationery that aimed at contrition but lacked the texture of remorse that comes easily when people change. He asked for forgiveness and offered, "I was sorry," which is meaningful but too thin. I did not take the meeting. That does not make me cruel. It makes me careful. Forgiveness is something many people say, it is not a thing I am required to provide on a timetable. There is healing that happens in distance. There is also the fact that the man who had plotted my ruin had never made the simplest effort to understand why his actions were destructively wrong beyond fearing punishment. I kept his letter in a box in the attic of the lake house and checked it now and again like a relic, a cautionary object. My parents, meanwhile, had lived a different fall. George's reputation was destroyed. The mortgage firm that had employed him had separated itself and his colleagues found themselves needing to protect themselves from association. He died of a heart attack 2 years after the trial, collapsed by the bed in the small apartment where he'd been trying to live quietly. His death felt small to me, not because I did not want to grieve, but because grief that is not complicated is rare. I had both grief and the memory of how their indifference had been arranged across decades. Marianne was left, then, to navigate the world without the scaffolding that had once held her up. It is strange to describe the slow erosion of someone's social life. The country club where she had played tennis stopped inviting her to social lunches. The book club members sent terse emails. Donations dried. She tried to call old friends. Some did not pick up. Others said that they could not be associated with a scandal. She moved into a small apartment not far from town and got a part-time job at a call center, taking reservations for a restaurant she could not afford. There are people who would say I should feel a pang of pity. I did not enough to change my life. It wasn't cruelty. It was the consequence of choices with moral weight. If you stab someone in the back to gain a little social advantage, you should not be surprised when the social net you relied on falls away. There are interesting ripples in the life that continues. Donors who had once attended my mother's galas ended up saying things like, "We supported her efforts for years and never saw this coming," which is a curious sentiment. Most of what I had to prove was not whether my mother had been cruel, but that she had been actively cruel and would plan harm deliberately. The donors stopped showing up because their money is often the mechanism through which social endorsement operates. No one who runs a charity wants to involve tea. There's no question that watching someone you loved fall apart is not pleasant. There's also no question that what my family plotted felt like a direct attempt to erase me with theatrics. They had denied me so many little things, the new car, the private school, the attention that made me feel like anyone saw me. That hurt in a way that stayed lodged in my ribs for years. Instead of letting it bury me, I chose a kind of survival that involved exposure. I made it public because a private humiliation has a way of continuing to metastasize when undisclosed. If you wanted to make sure something didn't happen to someone else, you told the truth. Not everyone agreed with me. There were op-eds. There were columnist pieces. Sister betrayal goes too far. White-collar scandal in Chicago. People on daytime television debated whether I had gone too far by making the email public. The standard response in some circles was to worry about whether reputations had been permanently damaged. But those people were not the ones whose wedding day was stolen from them. They were not the ones who had been locked in a hotel room by their own family. They were not required to reconcile the moral calculus of a small life built on cruelty. We married in a small ceremony beneath an old oak tree at the Davenport estate. Lucas's parents played bridge in the afternoon and Patricia baked a lemon cake that tasted like all the good things that had come after the wreckage. My father was not there. My mother, after an initial attempt to reconcile that I rebuffed, made a perfunctory apology that sounded like a press release. Marianne called once, months later, from a landline and said, "It was all such a mistake, Isabella." She never asked if I was okay. She never asked to sit with me and talk about what had gone wrong in a way that might have felt human. Instead she asked about appearances. That was the last conversation I had with her that could be called a conversation at all. I told the story to audiences later, when people asked me how they should proceed in similar situations. I spoke about documentation, preserve the messages, save the screenshots, collect witnesses, but also about interior resistance. Trust your instincts, I would say. If the people around you suddenly change their behavior based on someone's name or money, pay attention. If you suspect someone is being manipulative, gather evidence. It's not a moralistic lecture, it's the practical guidance you learn when you lose the capacity to assume goodwill. It is tempting now to say that everything was perfect afterwards, that justice was clean. Life is never that tidy. There were dark days when I sat in the kitchen of the lakeside villa and remembered the sterile, sunless hotel room. There were nightmares. It took me time to stop panicking at small noises, to stop flinching when phones rang at odd hours. I went to therapy with a woman named Sarah who had a soft way of asking hard questions. She told me, with a gravity that made sense, that healing is irregular. You're not fixing one thing, she said. You're building back a lot of little things. That felt right. There was no single moment of redemption, there were small acts, friends who stayed, their hands on my shoulder at the courthouse, Lucas holding me in the hallway between hearings, the way our daughter opened a book and read aloud in a voice that melted the worst parts of me. In the attic of the lake house, I still keep a box with the letters and the documents, copies of the emails, the police report, the court transcripts. I keep them not as trophies, but as reminders. People ask if I ever regret exposing everything. Some would call it public shaming, others called it righteous exposure. The simplest answer is this: I regret none of the facts. I regret not talking to Lucas about the exchange in the hallway the night he met Ethan. I regret trusting and assuming too much. I regret getting locked in that hotel room because I could have left the room the moment the lock clicked, but I didn't because I had a fragile faith that family would not do such a thing. That was not a mistake I would make again. Over the years our life ossified into a pattern of small joys and work. Lucas built a modest office for himself down the lane, Patricia started a community reading program, and I continued to plan events but with a new wariness and a new appreciation for a guest list that included only those I trusted. We talked about possible reconciliations with relatives, and then refused them. It is not that I am vengeful. It is that I wanted to live in a world where actions carry consequences. The question wasn't whether my family would survive their fall, they did, in fractured ways. The question was, would they take responsibility? Years later, when my son was 5 and my daughter 8, we threw a small party on the lawn for their birthdays. Margaret handed her cake to her grandmother, Patricia, and the older woman cried. I stood on the porch and watched my family move in a way I had always imagined moving, connected, small and loud, messy with life. Sometimes, perhaps when the wind is the right kind, I think of Marianne and George as people who lived their affections in a narrow, quiet kingdom where one child's light had to be muted for another to shine. I do not have to forgive them to give myself peace. I can choose to simply watch what time does. Time has returned me to better things, a life full of love and children and small daily revelations. That is where I rest. And once in a while, when friends ask me if I feel vindicated, I do. Not because I enjoyed watching their lives collapse, I did not, but because I took back what was mine. They had tried to take my wedding day like a vulgar theft. They had tried to tell the world I was unstable and unworthy. I exposed them and, in doing so, found not just justice but a place where I belonged. When I stand on the porch of the lake house now, with my children chasing the dog across the yard and Lucas laughing in the kitchen, I feel a fierce and quiet satisfaction. I have a home where people know my name, where my story is not the thing of mockery but a thing of truth. The rest of the world is complicated and often unfair, but I can see the arc. Those who built their lives on cruelty find their scaffolding fall away, and those who were overlooked finally get to write the rest of the story in a voice that doesn't need permission. I suppose, if you had asked me on that morning at the Drake Hotel whether I could have imagined saying all of this, I would have laughed. Pain is an ugly and honest teacher. It teaches you boundaries you might not otherwise know you needed. But from the shards of that horror grew a life I would not trade. It is quieter and kinder than the life I imagined when I was 27 and greedy for approval. It is nuanced, weighted with daily practice. And that is a richness I can live with happily. The last detail, Ethan, released on parole several years later, did try once more to reach out, not with apologies to me, but with something that read like a plea. He wanted to meet, to parse, to fix. He thought that meetings could bulldoze over consequences. I did not respond, and someone later told me he had begun a small, anonymous life in a place that nobody knew him. My parents eventually moved to a town where people didn't ask their last name. Marianne occasionally sends postcards with scenes of beaches she can no longer afford to visit. They lived with consequences. They lived with the quiet that follows decisions. I live with the children's laughter, the smell of coffee in the afternoon, friends who know the truth of me. I live with Lucas, who sometimes still blushes when he tells me how sorry he was that I had to find out the worst of it in that way. I live with that apology and with the way he steadied me in the court hallway while the DA presented the evidence. I do not dwell on vindictiveness. I prefer to live in a place where truth matters. And when someone asks if I wanted them to suffer, I always answer the same. No, I say. I wanted the truth to be told. I wanted consequences that fit the harm. And I wanted to make sure no one else is trapped like that. It is a practical ethic. It is a necessary one for some of us who have woken up to the fact that people we assume will love us sometimes choose cruelty instead. So that is the story, expanded and complete, a story of betrayal, public exposure, judicial consequence, and a slow, steady construction of a life that made the ruins worthwhile. It remains, for me, a story that proves how fragile privilege can be and how resilient a person becomes when she chooses to tell the truth.